The global chip race is intensifying as nations tighten control over semiconductors and alliances. What happens when chips become political weapons? The US has declared that Huawei's AI chips, Ascend 910, 910B, 910C, and 910D, may breach export laws if used anywhere in the world. The Commerce Department claims these chips contain American origin technologies, even though no specific evidence has been released. China objected, warning of legal action against entities enforcing the sanctions. Beijing called it a trade power misuse that risks disrupting global supply chains and widening tech divides. Tighter sanctions may limit AI hardware access, especially for small US firms reliant on foreign partners. Startups using cloud platforms tied to Huawei risk non-compliance. Consumers could face slower AI rollouts, reduced innovation in smart devices, and higher costs for services like translation and virtual assistants. On a high-stakes trip to the Middle East, former President Trump urged Saudi Arabia to invest up to $1 trillion in America's semiconductor and AI industries. The proposal grew from an initial $600 billion ask to $1.2 trillion, aimed at closing funding gaps amid U.S. budget strains. But Saudi Arabia faces its own fiscal challenges, including a $15.7 billion deficit in the first quarter of 2025, and massive domestic spending needs like the $1.5 trillion NEOM project. This casts doubt on how much support it can offer to U.S. tech. If successful, the deal could boost U.S. chip production, lower electronics prices, and create jobs in states like Arizona, Texas, and Ohio. Without funding, the U.S. risks falling behind Asia, keeping costs high for devices, and limiting AI access for students and small businesses. China is responding to U.S. pressure by massively increasing its domestic semiconductor investments. By 2025, it plans to spend over $38 billion, with a new national IC fund worth $47.5 billion already in motion. Beijing is prioritizing R&D and production through companies like Huawei, supported by cheap financing, just 1.9% bond rates, compared to over 4.4% in the US. As China becomes more self-reliant, American access to certain low-cost chips may shrink. US device makers could face higher prices for core components, rippling out to consumer electronics and home appliances. Over time, fewer US exports to China might hurt sectors like cloud computing and semiconductors, key job providers in California and Oregon. There's also concern that a tech bifurcation could slow global standards, leading to fragmented platforms and poorer user experience. The US is sending hundreds of thousands of Nvidia's advanced Blackwell AI chips to Saudi Arabia and the UAE via startup Humane. Saudi Arabia alone will receive 18,000 chips to power a planned 500-megawatt AI data center. The effort aims to bolster ties and compete with China's growing influence in the Gulf. But offshoring so many high-end AI chips may temporarily tighten domestic supply. AI developers in the US, especially smaller firms and universities, could see delays in accessing Blackwell chips, potentially slowing innovation in healthcare, education, and research. There are also national security concerns. If these chips are repurposed or leaked to adversaries, the US could face long-term strategic vulnerabilities in AI and defense sectors. In 2025, sudden tariff cuts from 145% to 30% triggered a rapid surge in imports and severe port congestion. U.S. supply chains are strained, and inflation risks are rising. How will these trade policy swings reshape American consumers and businesses? In April 2025, the Trump administration imposed a 145% tariff on Chinese imports, sharply reducing trade flows between the two nations. This move caused immediate disruptions in supply chains and higher costs for U.S. businesses. But in May, the tariff was unexpectedly lowered to 30% for a 90-day period, prompting American companies to rush import orders. Shipping bookings from China to the U.S. spiked over 50% in the first week of May, as firms scrambled to secure inventory before potential tariff reinstatement. Despite the tariff reduction, American consumers continue facing rising prices due to increased shipping and warehousing costs. Economists warn this volatility could drive inflation higher and push the U.S. economy toward recession if trade uncertainties persist. The inflation outlook remains fragile, with transportation cost increases directly impacting consumer goods prices. These tariff swings mean higher prices on everyday products, tightening household budgets, especially for middle and lower-income families. Increased import costs affect retail prices nationwide, while inflation pressures reduce purchasing power. Businesses face uncertainty in pricing and supply availability, complicating planning and investment decisions. U.S. ports like Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Seattle experienced extreme fluctuations due to the tariff changes. April saw a 44% drop in cargo volume at Long Beach, reflecting stalled imports amid high tariffs. But in May, cargo surged sharply as importers rushed goods before tariffs could rise again, leading to severe congestion. The ports oscillated between near inactivity and overwhelming demand within weeks, disrupting logistics and increasing delays. Port congestion delays goods reaching shelves, causing shortages and erratic product availability. Consumers may face empty shelves or delayed deliveries, impacting sectors from electronics to groceries. This congestion also increases operational costs for retailers, which can be passed on to consumers through higher prices. The ripple effects extended beyond the ports. Trucking firms like J.B. Hunt and Union Pacific reported record demand amid supply chain stress. Retailers Walmart and Target warned of product shortages and rising prices. The $906 billion U.S. trucking industry expects a crucial recovery period during the back-to-school shopping season, hinging on steady import flows. Supply chain pressures increase prices and reduce product variety, directly affecting household spending decisions. Transportation, bottlenecks, and shortages risk disrupting retail promotions and seasonal sales, adding financial strain to American families. Ongoing tariff uncertainty hampers long-term business planning, especially for small and medium enterprises struggling to adapt to fluctuating trade policies. Consumers face risks of price instability and inconsistent product availability. Experts urge the government to implement clearer, more stable trade rules to support economic resilience and protect the American public from volatility. Without stable policies, businesses hesitate to invest or expand, potentially slowing job growth and economic recovery. Consumers bear the brunt of unpredictability, experiencing price swings and supply gaps that affect daily life and economic confidence.
President Donald Trump has stirred significant discussion in the political arena with his pragmatic foreign policy approach, where the United States, China, and Russia dominate global influence. The question remains, can this strategy reshape the global order? Or is it a risky move by Trump? In early 2025, President Donald Trump proposed renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the American Gulf, arguing that the region holds strategic importance for the U.S. He emphasized the Gulf's vital role in maritime trade and resource extraction, particularly oil and natural gas. This proposal caught the attention of the Mexican government, with President Claudia Sheinbaum expressing concerns that the name would be inappropriate and disrespectful to the region's historical heritage. Mexico has since made efforts to protect the name Gulf of Mexico on international maps. Throughout his presidency, Donald Trump developed a unique relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin, even amid escalating tensions over the situation in Ukraine, where Russian forces continue their offensive. Meetings between Trump and Putin, especially the 2018 Helsinki summit, sparked controversy among international observers. Trump not only refrained from criticizing Putin for his interference in the 2016 U.S. elections, but also proposed closer cooperation between the two nations. Recently, Trump has again criticized U.S. foreign policy, suggesting that he might be the only leader capable of resolving the Ukraine conflict swiftly, though many view this stance as unrealistic, given the ongoing conflict and unresolved tensions between the two nations. Trump's leadership style, often described as transactional, has raised considerable debate. Throughout his term, he predominantly approached both domestic and international issues from the perspective of personal and national interests, rather than moral values or long-term leadership principles. He frequently sought short-term deals beneficial to the U.S. A clear example of this was his approach to trade relations with China, where he imposed high tariffs on Chinese goods, relying heavily on the power of sanctions and tough negotiations, rather than seeking long-term cooperative agreements. His views and actions have not always been predictable, and their instability has led to concerns about the absence of an overarching strategy in foreign policy. Donald Trump has made notable efforts to facilitate ceasefire agreements in the Middle East, particularly in the Israel-Gaza conflict. One of his significant actions was negotiating and facilitating a ceasefire agreement in early 2025 between Israel and Palestinian forces. However, his proposals, especially regarding Gaza's future, met with strong opposition from hard-right Israeli groups, who criticized him for not adopting a tougher stance toward Gaza and Palestine. Despite these reactions, rumors suggest the possibility of a new ceasefire agreement, potentially tied to Trump's upcoming visit to Saudi Arabia next month. President Donald Trump holds a clear strategic vision for the global power structure, which he believes will be dominated by three major powers: the United States, China, and Russia. In Trump's view, these nations will take center stage in global affairs, with the U.S. intervening in strategic regions, including the Asia-Pacific, the Middle East, and Europe. He focuses on safeguarding American interests, particularly through hardline trade strategies with China, aimed at reducing trade deficits and protecting domestic industries. Simultaneously, Trump has shown a degree of support for Russian policies, especially in Ukraine and Syria, reflecting his pragmatic foreign policy approach that prioritizes short-term agreements. Why is China pouring tens of billions of dollars into Africa while the United States appears to be stepping back? Is this silent competition reshaping the balance of power on the continent? In 2024, China committed $51 billion in direct investment and signed $70.7 billion in construction contracts across Africa, more than 15 times the U.S. foreign aid budget for the region, which stands at $8 billion through U.S. aid. According to the Asia Society, 75% of respondents in the region view Beijing positively, while only 25% hold a negative opinion. A survey by Afrobarometer across 34 African countries found that 63% of citizens see China's influence as very or somewhat positive, while just 15% perceive it negatively. This is reflected in tangible results over 10,000 kilometers of roads. Hundreds of schools, hospitals, and bridges have been built with Chinese support. These projects directly improve daily life, easing transportation, expanding access to education, and enhancing healthcare services. While the United States continues to focus on humanitarian aid, China's model of infrastructure for resources is generating strong and visible impact. The Democratic Republic of the Congo currently supplies approximately 70% of the world's cobalt, a key material used in electric vehicle batteries and high-tech devices. China has made substantial investments in this sector, holding stakes in 15 of the country's largest cobalt and copper mines. In 2024, Chinese companies committed to investing $7 billion in infrastructure in the DRC, including roads and power plants, under a Resource for Infrastructure agreement. Meanwhile, the United States continues to prioritize humanitarian aid, allocating $8 billion to the entire African continent through USAID for the fiscal year 2024. This difference in approach has a direct impact on the daily lives of local populations. In the DRC, Chinese-backed infrastructure projects have improved transportation and electricity access, helping to foster economic development. In contrast, U.S. aid has mainly focused on healthcare and education, offering long-term benefits in public health and literacy. In early 2025, the Trump administration decided to end funding for PEPFAR, the U.S. president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, which had provided approximately $440 million annually to South Africa's HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment efforts. This decision threatens the jobs of around 15,000 healthcare workers and affects over 5.5 million people currently receiving antiretroviral treatment in a country with the world's highest HIV infection rate. In response, the South African government increased its 2025 health budget by 28.9 billion rand, approximately $1.5 billion US dollars. However, to offset the financial gap, the government was compelled to raise the value-added tax by 0.5%, leading to higher prices for essential goods and services. The reduction in aid has not only strained the public healthcare system, but also added financial pressure on citizens. Meanwhile, other nations such as China continue to expand their presence through development investment and infrastructure support, raising questions about the future of U.S. influence on the continent. President Trump has launched a sweeping tariff offensive, triggering surging prices, market volatility, and a looming retaliation from Europe. Can American consumers weather this economic storm? On April 7, 2025, President Trump unveiled the Liberation Day tariff package, imposing a 10% tariff on all imports and higher rates on specific countries, 20% on the European Union, 46% on Vietnam, and 145% on China. The total value of goods subject to tariffs during his second term has surpassed $1 trillion and could reach $3 trillion if fully implemented. Prices of food, medicine, and electronics have soared, a poll by AP. NORC found that 52% of Americans oppose the blanket tariffs, with 60% believing the policy has gone too far. Major retailers, including Walmart, Target, and Home Depot, have met with the president to raise concerns over rising costs and potential supply shortages. U.S. factories are facing higher input costs due to reliance on parts from the EU, which could lead to wage cuts or layoffs. A 24% tariff on Japanese goods has delayed shipments of the Nintendo Switch 2, crashing pre-order systems on major retail sites like Target and Best Buy. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen declared that all measures are on the table in response to U.S. tariffs. The EU is preparing to impose tariffs on $28 billion worth of American goods, including automobiles, whiskey, and agricultural products. Europe is reinforcing trade agreements with more than 76 countries, including Mercosur, Mexico, and upcoming deals with India and ASEAN, while strengthening internal market integration to reduce dependence on the U.S. American farmers face mounting export risks, especially in corn. Soybeans and beef states like Iowa, Nebraska, and Texas are expected to bear the brunt in the beverage industry. Breweries in Asheville, North Carolina, report a sharp rise in aluminum can costs due to disrupted European supply chains. U.S. financial markets have endured their worst quarter since 2022. The S&P 500 dropped 4.6%, NASDAQ fell 10.4%, and the Dow Jones slid 2.2%. Investor uncertainty over Trump's tariff policy has rattled the markets. Goldman Sachs has raised the probability of a U.S. recession to 45%, predicting the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates 3 times in 2025. Falling stock values have alarmed retirees, with heavy sell-offs reported in personal investment accounts and 401k, retirement funds. Consumer sentiment is weakening. The Conference Board's March 2025 Consumer Confidence Index dropped by 11 points from the previous month. American farmers are enduring a brutal economic fallout from trade wars with exports, collapsing production costs, soaring and no solutions in sight. Can the U.S. agriculture sector survive this disaster? Sorghum exports to China have dropped 95%. In just 2 months of 2025, U.S. sorghum exports plummeted from 1.4 million tons to just 78,000 tons compared to the previous year. China once bought 90% of U.S. sorghum, but the market has vanished almost overnight. Other major crops like soybeans, corn, and wheat are also suffering, with prices falling and stockpiles growing. This sharp decline in demand is leaving U.S. farmers with millions of tons of unsold crops in silos, significantly hurting cash flow. The lack of buyers is pushing family-owned farms to the brink of extinction, especially as prices continue to plummet with no market alternatives in sight. China has raised tariffs to over 125% on a broad range of U.S. agricultural products, including soybeans, pork, corn, cotton, and dairy. In addition, the EU has also imposed 25% tariffs on key U.S. farm exports, like soybeans and processed pork, in retaliation for U.S. steel tariffs. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Russia are now filling the gaps left by the U.S., signing long-term trade deals that are shifting global supply chains. Permanently, farmers are seeing their once dominant positions in global markets erode with tariffs, pricing U.S. goods out of major markets like China. The agricultural sector faces long-term structural losses that will be hard to recover from. American farmers are now competing with cheaper products from other nations, leaving them vulnerable to further losses. A New York dairy farmer is facing an additional $2,200 in costs for livestock feed due to new tariffs on Canadian imports. Prices for fertilizers, seeds, and machinery are all on the rise because of tariffs on U.S. trading partners, putting immense pressure on farmers' budgets. Meanwhile, crop prices are falling, creating a double squeeze on U.S. farmers' profits. The escalating costs of production are making it increasingly difficult for farmers to turn a profit. With the prices of essential farm inputs like feed and fertilizer rising, and crop prices declining, many farmers are struggling to cover their basic operating expenses. The economic pressure is mounting, threatening their ability to stay afloat. Rural banks are warning of rising default risks as farmers face growing pressure from unstable crop prices and mounting debt. Many farmers are hesitant to sign contracts due to market volatility, fearing they will grow crops no one will buy. Despite some calls for new bailout packages worth billions, many farmers are voicing a preference for trade deals over government checks. As the financial crisis deepens, farmers are facing a real threat of bankruptcy. The increasing instability in the agricultural sector is putting banks and small rural economies at risk. The proposed government relief packages are seen as short-term solutions, with no clear path to restore long-term market access and stability. EU diversifies partners, looks to internal market to counter potential 144 billion euros loss. Could these strategies safeguard Europe's supply chains and global standing against pressure from Washington? In 2023, the European Union was the world's largest trading power, accounting for 16.1% of global trade, valued at 7.6 trillion euros, according to Eurostat 2024. The U.S. remains the EU's largest trade partner, representing 17% of EU trade, equating to 1.6 trillion euros. However, this trade relationship lacks any free trade agreement, FTA, protection. Under former President Donald Trump, the U.S. imposed tariffs of up to 25% on imported cars from the EU and 10% across the board. Alarmingly, Trump's trade advisors are suggesting a return of a 20% tariff on all EU goods within the first 3 months if he re-enters the White House, according to Bloomberg. According to the European Commission, a retaliatory tariff war at 25% could reduce EU exports to the US by 17.5%, causing a direct loss of 0.54% of the EU's GDP, which is equivalent to 144 billion euros, according to a European Commission trade impact study. US consumers would face sharp price increases on imported goods from Europe, including cars, wine, and industrial equipment. The Brookings Institution predicts core inflation could rise by an additional 0.3 percentage points if these tariffs are reinstated, according to Brookings. To reduce dependency on the US, the EU is accelerating FTA negotiations with emerging economies. India is a top priority. If an FTA is concluded, the import tariff on cars could drop from over 100% to just 10%, according to Reuters. Bilateral trade between the EU and India is projected to reach 167 billion euros by 2026, with EU exports totaling 75 billion euros and imports from India reaching 93 billion euros. Additionally, a deal with Mercosur, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay could boost total trade to 126 billion euros, with the EU exporting 77 billion euros and importing 49 billion euros. For Mexico, improving market access alone could increase EU exports by 20%, or 10 billion euros. In total, if all 3 FTAs are approved before 2026, the EU could recover around 91 billion euros, though it would still fall 53 billion euros short of the losses from the US. Alongside expanding partnerships, the European Commission is calling for improvements to the EU's single market, established in 1993. While barriers to goods have been removed, 3 key pillars, services, capital, and labor, still face significant hurdles due to national laws. For example, Polish plumbers must recertify to practice in Belgium. Startups in Portugal struggle to raise funds from the Netherlands due to differing investment laws. And EU citizens face bureaucratic obstacles when working in other member states. According to a new study by the European Parliament, this lack of integration costs the EU 1.1 trillion euros annually, 279 billion euros from services, 415 billion euros from the digital market, 300 billion euros from goods, and 50 billion euros from public procurement, according to European Parliament policy study. If reforms are implemented, the EU could fully recover the 144 billion euros loss from US tariffs, while also boosting its internal competitiveness. Canada is severing vital ties with the United States, from energy and security to politics. What is happening after the statement? Canada is the 51st state. And why are citizens calling for national self-defense? Manitoba Hydro, one of Canada's major energy providers, has terminated 2 electricity export contracts to the United States equivalent to 500 megawatts per day. Following former President Donald Trump's announcement of a 25% tariff on Canadian energy and goods, the redirected power will now serve domestic regions such as Nunavut, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. The Manitoba provincial government stated this move is part of an effort to reclaim energy sovereignty amid ongoing trade dependence on the US. However, the decision may leave Manitoba Hydro facing up to CAD 25 billion in debt, prompting the company to propose an 11% electricity rate increase, starting in 2026 to offset revenue. Losses residents in Manitoba and Ontario may face increased financial pressure as electricity prices rise during a time of climbing living costs. The exit from the U.S. energy market also presents long-term questions for Canada regarding energy security and export diversification. Amid rising trade and political tensions between Canada and the United States, former President Trump has repeatedly referred to Canada as the 51st state. This rhetoric has raised concerns about bilateral relations and Canada's national security. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney publicly rejected President Trump's remarks, emphasizing the importance of defending Canada's sovereignty and independence. He also called for increased defense spending and reduced reliance on the U.S. in security matters. Both the Liberal and Conservative parties have expressed support for strengthening national defense and diversifying international partnerships. In Canada's parliament, some members questioned whether NATO would intervene in the event of a conflict between Canada and the U.S. Under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, NATO responds only when a member is attacked by an external force. As such, a dispute between two NATO members may not prompt intervention, raising concerns about Canada's independent defense capabilities. Many Canadians have expressed anxiety about the future of the country and its relationship with the United States. Citizens are urging the government